Hello and welcome to the unseen question. The promise of paradise sounds comforting on the surface, but when you look closely, the idea of heaven doesn't hold together as well as it seems. For many people, it's presented as the ultimate reward, the place where pain ends, happiness never fades, and everything finally makes sense. But if we take the idea seriously, and not just as a vague story told in childhood, we start to notice some serious problems. Not small issues, but fundamental ones that make the concept of heaven collapse under its own weight. The first problem is actually the simplest one: boredom. If heaven is supposed to be eternal life, that means not just a long time, but forever. Human minds are wired for novelty, for change, for limits. We enjoy things because they end, because experiences are rare and fragile. Think about your favorite meal. Part of why it's satisfying is that you don't eat it every day. But if you had to eat it for every meal, forever, it would stop being joyful. The same goes for music, relationships, hobbies, or even peace itself. In a world without challenge or endings, everything eventually flattens into monotony. Eternity sounds appealing only when we don't think through what eternity actually means. And that connects to another problem: identity. Our personalities, our drives, and our relationships are built on struggle, on imperfection, on making mistakes and learning from them. If heaven promises a world with no mistakes, no failures, no risks, then it also erases what makes us who we are. A person without flaws, without struggles, without needs, is not really a person anymore. It's more like a statue, perfect maybe, but lifeless. What's left of individuality in a place where no one can change, grow, or choose badly? The very process of becoming human is stripped away, leaving behind a hollow version of existence. Then there's the issue of justice. Heaven is often framed as a fair system. Good people are rewarded, bad people punished elsewhere. But real life shows us that morality is far more complicated than that. People aren't simply good or bad. Most of us are mixtures of kindness and selfishness, wisdom and foolishness, compassion and cruelty. And even then, what counts as good is different depending on where and how you're raised. The idea that a divine being could sort people cleanly into two eternal categories doesn't match the complexity of real human lives. It feels more like a children's story than a serious way of looking at justice. What makes this problem even deeper is the fact that heaven is usually offered on conditions that don't seem fair. Belief, loyalty, or obedience to a certain faith often matter more than actual character or behavior. That means a kind, decent person who grows up outside the right belief system could be excluded, while someone cruel or abusive but devout could be welcomed in. If heaven is supposed to represent ultimate fairness, then it fails its own test the moment it makes belief more important than goodness. There's also the issue of freedom. If heaven is a place where no one can sin, then by definition no one can choose. Free will only means something if you can actually make a bad choice. If all the bad options are removed in heaven, then what remains isn't freedom at all. It's just pre-programmed behavior. But if bad choices are allowed, then heaven can't be free of suffering. Either way, the concept can't hold together. A world without freedom isn't paradise. It's a carefully designed cage, even if the walls are painted with gold. And when we talk about relationships, heaven presents another contradiction. The people you love most, family, friends, partners, are central to your life here. But in heaven, what happens if they don't make it? If someone you love is excluded, can paradise really be joyful? If your happiness depends on ignoring the suffering of others, then it isn't real happiness, it's just denial. A paradise where you're required to forget or suppress love for those who aren't there doesn't sound like paradise at all. It sounds like emotional numbness disguised as joy. On top of all this, heaven relies on a vague promise that can't be tested or confirmed. It places the reward always beyond reach, always after death, always out of evidence. That makes it function less like a reality and more like a control mechanism. When people are told that true happiness comes only later, it can make them more willing to accept injustice now. It can shift attention away from solving problems in this world, because the promise of another world is waiting. The very concept that's supposed to inspire hope can quietly encourage passivity, and that has real consequences for how societies deal with suffering, inequality, and progress. Another layer to this problem comes from how heaven is usually described in religious texts. The descriptions are often vague, symbolic, or contradictory. In some traditions, it's endless worship. In others, it's gardens, mansions, or reunions with loved ones. Sometimes it's a city with golden streets. Sometimes it's complete union with a divine being. The lack of clarity might seem harmless, but it actually points to something deeper. No one really knows what they're talking about. If the idea of paradise was a real destination, we'd expect some consistency in how it's described. Instead, it shifts depending on culture, era, or the imagination of whoever's preaching. This tells us that heaven isn't an observed reality. It's a projection of human desires, fears, and guesses. That projection explains why different versions of paradise reflect the values of the societies that create them. Agricultural communities describe heaven as fertile fields. Warrior cultures imagine it as endless feasting after battle. Modern believers picture it as a luxury resort or a family reunion. In each case, heaven looks suspiciously like an exaggerated version of what people already want in their current lives. Instead of being evidence for another world, it becomes a mirror of this one. Paradise changes with human culture because it's created by human culture. But even if we set aside the contradictions and cultural tailoring, we run into an even more serious issue: the problem of meaning. Human life gets its meaning precisely because it's limited. We care about what we do because time is scarce. Every choice matters because opportunities run out. Death is frightening, yes, but it also gives life its urgency. Without it, the weight of choices collapses. If you can do anything forever, then nothing you do really matters. The scarcity that makes life precious disappears. Eternity turns meaning into sand slipping through an infinite hourglass, never ending, but never significant either. There's also a psychological angle worth considering. Studies in positive psychology consistently show that happiness doesn't come from static pleasure, but from dynamic balance, struggle, recovery, challenge, and achievement. People need goals, obstacles, and growth to feel alive. A life of endless leisure, with every wish instantly granted, quickly becomes unsatisfying. We've seen this even in small experiments. When people are given too much wealth, too much comfort, or too much free time, their sense of purpose often erodes. Now stretch that to eternity, and the problem becomes overwhelming. A heaven that eliminates all difficulty also eliminates the very conditions that make fulfillment possible. The seventh major problem is how heaven is used socially. The promise of paradise isn't just personal, it often functions as a tool of control. Leaders can demand loyalty, obedience, or sacrifice by promising rewards that no one can ever verify. People are told to accept suffering, to give up their own desires, or even to fight and die in wars, because their true reward lies somewhere else. This isn't harmless wishful thinking. It has shaped history in profound ways. From crusades to suicide bombings, from political manipulation to cult abuse, the promise of heaven has been used again and again to justify suffering in this world. A paradise that's always just out of reach can be the most effective leash. And we shouldn't overlook the personal costs. Belief in heaven often comes paired with belief in hell. For every person comforted by the idea of eternal reward, there's someone terrified of eternal punishment. Surveys show that fear of hell is one of the most common religious anxieties, especially in children raised with strict teachings. The psychological damage can last a lifetime. Nightmares, guilt, even trauma. Heaven isn't just a comforting story. It's part of a system that creates as much fear as hope. The carrot only works because the stick is dangling next to it. Even without hell in the picture, the idea of heaven still creates subtle pressures. People start to devalue this life, thinking of it as temporary or insignificant. Real relationships, real struggles, real joys can all be dismissed as just a test or a waiting room for the real thing. That mindset can rob life of its depth. When you think your true home is elsewhere, you risk never fully inhabiting the one you actually have. Entire generations can grow up treating the earth as disposable because paradise is somewhere else. And in an era where climate change, inequality, and global conflict demand urgent attention, the cost of that mindset is enormous. When we step back and look at all of this together, the problems pile up. Eternity undermines joy. Perfection erases individuality. Justice becomes oversimplified and unfair. Freedom disappears. Relationships are hollowed out. Meaning dissolves into endless time. And the promise itself is used to control rather than liberate. What was supposed to be the ultimate solution ends up looking like another problem, just a more polished one. But perhaps the most telling point of all is this. When people describe their personal visions of heaven, they often contradict the official teachings of their own religion. They don't want an eternity of worship. They want to travel, to learn, to reconnect with loved ones. They want hobbies, conversations, laughter, exploration. In other words, they describe not a perfect otherworldly paradise, but an improved version of this world. That suggests something important. What people actually want isn't heaven at all, but a better earth. A place where suffering is reduced, where relationships thrive, where justice is fair, and where joy is possible in spite of limits. And that's something we don't need myths to build. It's something we can work toward here and now. There's another hidden contradiction worth pointing out. In many traditions, heaven is supposed to be the ultimate reunion, the place where you'll see your loved ones again. On the surface, that sounds beautiful, but if we think carefully, it raises impossible questions. Relationships on Earth are complex, layered, and often messy. People grow apart, fall out, hold grudges, or experience loss. If heaven erases all conflict and makes everyone perfectly content, then those relationships aren't really preserved. They're replaced with some sanitized version. It's not your loved one as you knew them. It's a perfected copy with all their edges sanded down. And if the people you cared about didn't make it, then the promise of reunion is broken anyway. Either way, the story doesn't match the reality of how love and memory actually work. Even the idea of perfect happiness is less coherent than it sounds. Human emotions function like a spectrum. Joy exists in contrast with sadness. Relief comes only after stress. Love deepens because of the risk of losing it. Strip away those contrasts and the emotions flatten out. Eternal joy without tension stops being joy. It becomes static. Like a note held forever, it eventually fades into silence. We can't have emotional depth without the play of opposites. A heaven that removes all sadness removes the very conditions that make happiness meaningful. This brings us to another subtle issue: creativity. Much of what humans cherish most comes from grappling with difficulty. Great art, literature, music, and philosophy often emerge from pain, longing, or conflict. Without imperfection, there's nothing to wrestle with, nothing to express. A heaven without struggle would also be a heaven without creativity. The music would never change, the stories would never surprise, and the art would never move you. It would all become decoration instead of expression. And then there's growth. Human beings don't just live, they become. Our values, our skills, our wisdom, even our empathy are all products of growth through time. We learn from mistakes, we adapt to challenges, we mature. But eternity in heaven freezes growth. Once you've arrived, you're done. You no longer need to change because you've supposedly reached the end of the journey. But if change stops, so does life in any meaningful sense. Growth is what makes existence feel alive. Without it, eternity isn't life. It's just stasis. Some defenders of the idea try to respond to this by saying heaven would contain endless opportunities to learn, discover, and grow. But if that's the case, then heaven can't be perfect yet. Growth requires imperfection, ignorance, limits, obstacles. If those still exist, then heaven isn't free of struggle. And if they don't exist, then growth ends. Either way, the idea collapses under its own contradictions. You can't have a state that's both complete and still unfolding. You can't have a world that's both perfect and still changing. Let's also look at how heaven interacts with morality. If the ultimate motivation for doing good is to get into paradise, then moral behavior is no longer about compassion, empathy, or justice. It becomes a transaction. Help the poor, be rewarded later. Forgive your enemies. Earn points in heaven. Avoid sin. Secure your spot. But morality that depends on reward isn't morality at all. True goodness means acting because it's right, not because it pays off. When heaven is the motivation, it risks turning every act of kindness into a disguised form of self-interest, and that undermines the very values it's supposed to promote. There's also the exclusivity problem. Many versions of heaven are limited to a chosen group, those who believe the right things, performed the right rituals, or belonged to the right community. That means billions of humans across history are excluded by default. It reduces the diversity and richness of human life to a narrow slice. A heaven populated only by one group is not a celebration of humanity but a reduction of it. And if you start adding exceptions, if you say anyone decent can get in regardless of belief, then you've abandoned the very religious framework that proposed heaven in the first place. Either way, the coherence unravels. On top of all this, the promise of paradise often discourages people from facing the hardest truth, that death is real and final. By denying mortality, heaven avoids the very thing that gives life intensity and urgency. When people accept that life ends, it can actually lead to deeper appreciation. Sunsets feel brighter, conversations more precious, choices more urgent. Paradoxically, it's mortality that makes life vivid. By trying to erase death, heaven erases the fire that gives life its color. One of the most striking things we see when we step back is how little paradise resembles the actual needs of human psychology. Humans need contrast, growth, novelty, challenge, risk, and imperfection. Heaven removes all of these. What remains is an idea that looks comforting when sketched vaguely on a page, but falls apart when we test it against what we know about the human mind. It doesn't match what makes us thrive. It doesn't align with how meaning actually works. It promises more than it can deliver. And perhaps that's the final irony. Heaven is often presented as proof of a deeper, higher reality. But in practice, it looks more like the opposite, a human invention, stitched together from wishes, fears, and cultural habits. It promises endless comfort, but only by denying what actually makes life worth living. It claims to be ultimate justice, but it undermines fairness at its core. It offers reunion, but only by distorting relationships beyond recognition. It insists on eternal happiness, but only by flattening happiness until it loses its meaning. The closer you look, the more paradise resembles a mirage, attractive from a distance, but empty when you arrive. What makes the idea of heaven so persistent is not its logic, but its comfort. It tells us that pain is temporary, that injustice will be corrected, that love will never end, and that death isn't really the end. These are powerful promises, but they're promises that don't stand up to scrutiny. When we take them seriously and follow them through, we find contradictions stacked on contradictions. A paradise without freedom, without growth, without individuality, without justice, without contrast, without evidence, isn't really a paradise at all. It's a fantasy built to soothe fear, not a vision of reality. And that raises an important question. Why do we cling to it, and why does the idea of heaven continue to capture so many imaginations despite its flaws? Part of the answer lies in human psychology. Fear of death is universal and one of the strongest motivators in human behavior. Stories of heaven function as a coping mechanism, offering relief from the anxiety of mortality. Another part lies in social structures. Religions have relied on heaven as both a carrot and a stick, shaping behavior and ensuring loyalty. And another part lies in imagination itself. Humans are storytellers. When faced with the unknown, we weave stories. Heaven is one of those stories, but its persistence doesn't make it true. If anything, the persistence shows us something important about human nature. We long for justice, for love that endures, for lives that matter, for an end to suffering. These are real needs, and they deserve real solutions. But they don't need to be answered by fantasies. We don't need eternity to give life meaning. The limits of life give it meaning already. We don't need divine reward to justify morality. Compassion and empathy are enough. We don't need paradise elsewhere to build joy. We can create joy here, and we don't need golden streets or pearly gates to reunite with those we love. Memory, legacy, and the connections we build are what carry them forward. When you strip away the myth, what remains is a challenge, and also an opportunity. The challenge is that there is no cosmic safety net waiting beyond the horizon. The opportunity is that this makes our choices matter even more. If this life is all we have, then every act of kindness, every moment of beauty, every struggle for justice carries real weight. We can't postpone meaning to another world. We have to build it here with the time we're given. That urgency doesn't diminish life, it enriches it. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson hidden inside the failure of heaven. By seeing why paradise doesn't work as an idea, we learn to value the world we actually inhabit. We learn to face the fragility of life not with denial, but with courage. We learn to recognize that love is precious precisely because it ends, that justice matters precisely because it isn't guaranteed, that joy is sweet precisely because it's fleeting. Meaning is not waiting for us somewhere else. It's something we create here, together, in the face of impermanence. The problems with paradise reveal something deeper than the collapse of a myth. They reveal the truth that meaning doesn't require eternity. Happiness doesn't require perfection. Justice doesn't require divine sorting. Love doesn't require immortality. What matters most is already here, in the imperfect, fragile, fleeting world we share. And that is more powerful, more urgent, and more real than any promise of heaven could ever be.